Good evening. Welcome, welcome. Welcome to our new remote meetup, an evening with series. We are happy today to have our first international speaker this year. I'm talking about Herr Marco Heimeshoff from Germany. Hello, Marco, wie geht's?
Hi, Enrico, it's going good. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So Marco will be presenting his talk titled Inside Bounded Context very shortly. Let me just remind you that you can ask questions to Marco using the YouTube chat, and that will be available throughout the talk and that you can use during the presentation. Also, don't forget, if you haven't done it yet, to subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss the next videos. And now, Marco, over to you.
Oh yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm excited to give my first presentation via webcam. Let me quickly share my screen so you can see the slides, and I hope you see my face as well. So yeah, let's talk about bounded context. I made this talk because I'm working with domain-driven design for many years now, and bounded context mapping has always been one of the hardest tasks in the whole thing, and there was many misunderstandings about it. Most people try to build microservices and then say, hey, bounded context, isn't that a great microservicing tool? And it's like, not really the same, but it's really hard to explain. So I read up on it, I experimented with it, and I want to share my experience with bounded context modeling and mapping over the last few years. Quick introduction to myself. I've been working with software for the last 15 years, building healthcare systems in Germany, as well as I'm working as a trainer with, clicky doesn't work. Working as a trainer with Avanscoperta, teaching the domain models and practice workshop, which won't be in person this June for obvious reasons, but we'll get back there to that point later. I've also founded the German DDD community in 2013, and I'm organizing the DDD barbecue twice a year in my own home. And I'm one of the co-hosts on the virtual DDD website. So you see, domain-driven design is kind of my hobby and my job as well. And I also organize a conference, Kandinsky in Berlin, which is a conference about the art of business software, everything around domain-driven design and other topics for building better business software. Enough about me. We're here to talk about bounded context. So I'm going to have roughly 3 parts in this presentation. We talk about what is a bounded context, the nature of the relationships and how it impacts mapping, and complexity and evolution of bounded context. In between each of those, we will take a short break to answer your questions, so feel free to write away on YouTube, and Enrico will relay them towards me in the breaks. Okay, so what is a bounded context? To understand what a bounded context is, we first need to understand what a domain is. So a short reminder, a domain is an area of knowledge. It's a mental model that we have to work in and that we want to provide solutions for as software developers usually. And we build domain models in code that represent our mental models that we extract together with the business people. So if you work in online retailment, then online retailment is your domain. It's not just simply one big mental model. And if you build it as such, you're in a world of pain. What we do usually is we strip down the domain into subdomains, into smaller parts that we can solve problems for in isolation. So let's say you have sales and recommendation and payment and delivery and all those smaller parts in your domain. The areas that you decide to build a solution in are called in the solution space a bounded context, which is represented by these little circles here. Each have their own model, and these models, of course, have relationships to each other. But in this way, we can actually solve one problem at a time and focus our effort on the actual valuable parts of the domain instead of solving the whole thing at once. A bounded context is also an area where you can split your teams. So it's a business capability, a mental model around a business capability in which certain people work upon. You have technical people, programmers, testers, you have business people, and they all work in unison on this mental model, and they understand in which context they are in when they work on a model. Some people work in different contexts at different times of the day or in different times of the week, but once you are in a certain context, you understand, oh, this is where I'm working on, this thing is what I'm working with, and there's a specific language to this context. So the ubiquitous language, it's a term from domain-driven design, it's ubiquitous inside of that specific bounded context. That means it's in the head of the people working in that context, it's in their written communication, in the code. You find and you determine together words and sentences that have meaning specifically to people working in that context and in that area. It's also a boundary of autonomy. A team inside of a bounded context can work autonomously, decide on how to evolve the business inside of this specific part of the system without being bugged by people from other parts of the context, of the domain. And inside of a bounded context, you also have technical autonomy, meaning if you are working on a solution towards a certain business problem, you can decide inside of the bounded context what architecture you want to use, how your code should look like, what language to use, and even how to persist your information. Of course, between different bounded contexts, you can share data sources. You can have an agreement between people from different bounded contexts to say, we use the same SQL database, but we split our tables by namespace or something like that. But you have the freedom as a team in a bounded context to say, we want to retract from that decision. We are autonomously capable to deciding our own architecture, infrastructure, and persistence. The interaction between bounded contexts, of course, has to be negotiated between the people and the teams that have a relationship in their whole domain map. And then not every bounded context has the same value for the business. There is core domains in your system. There's the context why you exist, the thing that differentiates you from the market. So this is a reason why you're actually doing your business. And then there are supporting bounded contexts, which is anything that a business needs to support that core behavior. Let's say an online retailer like Amazon, they were a big sales company years ago. They started recommending better stuff. So their core business was a recommendation engine. Whoever bought stuff from them got better recommendations based on their past buyings, on their past sales and stuff they bought from Amazon. And this engine, this whole business logic behind it, that was a core business of the whole thing, of the whole company. But still, the warehouse had to deliver stuff and the payment system needed to work. But anything that is specific to your business, but not your reason of existing, is a supporting domain. And the supporting bounded context, they are none less valuable. They need to be there because if they don't work, your whole business can't operate, but they do not differentiate you from the market in the same way that a core business does. So focusing your resources on the core business, really focusing your development on optimizing the whole system of all the bounded contexts in a way that the core business can thrive. That's a goal of a good context map. And then of course you have generic bounded context in your business as well, which is the kind of bounded context that everybody has or many businesses have, not only yours specifically. It's not tied to your domain individually. So this could be a printing service, a document management system, any kind of payment service. Unless you're PayPal, then that's your core domain basically, but almost any other business has payment as a generic domain in it. So these are the three different kinds of bounded contexts you can have in your domain. And there are differences in how to deal with each of them. Generic bounded contexts can be bought off the shelf, or you can implement them yourself. That's a tactical decision. But a core domain can't be bought off the shelf, obviously, because it is your reason of being. This is where your innovation happens. This is where you want to excel. And a question I often hear in the project I'm working in for the last almost decade is, how many core domains can we have? Because we have like 30, and that doesn't make sense, especially if you're a 4-developer team. But the business people defined everything as being the most important and distinctive part of the business. And yeah, this is something for a longer dialogue. But as a rule of thumb, if your company is bigger, you can have, of course, more core domains. But if it gets out of hand, how many specific areas you're really focusing on can there be? If it gets into the 20s, 30s, 100, then it's probably not really a core domain, but you're just meandering all over the place. So you have relationships between your bounded contexts. And mapping your domain in a way that you separate different bounded contexts and the teams that work on those contexts makes it possible to have high cohesion inside of the bounded context itself. So in every context, the team, the software, the infrastructure, the domain, everything works highly cohesively together. Or if it doesn't, you can optimize it for it. You have a loose coupling between those contexts. So if I'm in a core domain and I want to change my infrastructure, I want to change how I store data, a supporting domain will not break because they make their own decisions about their own infrastructure. This makes every context loosely coupled, and we actually only have to interact, if it's well designed, when there's something really changing in the business that needs a business behavior to change. So now we have, for business reasons, to communicate. So Bounded contexts sound a lot like backend services or like backend behaviors that we want to encapsulate, but it has nothing to do with backend or frontend. The user journey, for example, can be its own bounded context. So you have your different contexts that we already mapped out, but the user journey is not inside of each of those bounded contexts. There is a user touching every part of the system. Recommendation engine is recommending stuff. I'm clicking on buying, then the warehouse and delivery system starts working, and then I also have to pay. So within a few seconds, I'm touching all the bounded contexts that work together to provide the whole system. But my journey has only very, very slight touchings into all of those contexts. I don't care about the intricate details as a user on your recommendation engine. I just see something that is recommended to me. I probably don't even know that there's an engine behind it. So the user journey in of itself can be its own bounded context, and having relationships towards each of the other bounded contexts with a tiny API representing only the part that the user needs to interact with, ask questions, and then give commands. So how do we get to such a bounded context map? How do we determine the different bounded contexts there are and their nature, and who the teams are working in them and who the experts are that we can invite to discuss about the domain models for the respective bounded contexts? Well, since you're on this channel of Avanscoperta, you probably have heard of event storming. And this is one of my favorite methods to get to a good context map. While I'm domain modeling anyhow with event storming, meaning I have business people in the room and technical people, and we put sticky notes on the wall of events that happened in the past in a timeline, and then adding the commands and the intentions and the business decisions, we see a little behavior where there are clumps of sticky notes in certain areas that seem like there's highly complex stuff happening, and then there are empty areas with only one or two messages going forward into the next area. So you can see there's people putting stuff into their shopping cart and deciding on things, and there are recommendations happening. Once I hit buy the shopping cart, there's a single message going to the next part of the whole system, telling the rest of the system, yeah, there's an order now that has to be fulfilled or can be canceled, but that's a different context now. And this is something that you get from your bounded context map. Like you see this empty area over here, then you know this is a probable candidate for bounded context, an initial heuristic. And another thing that I see and perceive during during event storming is, this is an example from an event storming in a chemical company. And it wasn't even a software project. It was just organizing how they work. And we realized quickly, there's this huge ball of sticky notes over here with complex behavior, but no one is standing in front of it. And what was happening is people modeled it, and this part was finished. It was pretty generic. It was pretty easy to understand, and there was no relationship with the rest. So isolated model, great. But then you see certain people standing in certain areas, and you realize, oh, these are the stakeholders for those bits of the system. So initially, you can just take a photo, look at the heads, and you know who the domain experts or the stakeholders will be for your teams inside of your bounded context, which is great. And then, not to go into architecture here, because this is not about programming today. This is about modeling bounded context maps. But if you do event sourcing and CQRS, you've probably seen this picture before. The messages inside of your bounded context, the commands you send in, the queries you can ask, the events that happen in your system, they are modeled in the ubiquitous language of the specific bounded contexts. So you see the language on the wall changing, going from left to right, step by step, and representing the actual ubiquitous language of the business experts that have been talking in the specific area of the context of the whole domain. So this not only gives you, the whole event storming doesn't only give you a very good heuristic for where the bounded contexts are and what the stakeholders are, but also an initial representation of your ubiquitous language, even if you're not doing message-driven architecture. Cool. So now we have all that said. I have a problem that I perceive in many companies, and that's people like new tools and they want to use those new tools to get really going. So we're in a hurry here. Let's just quickly map out the bounded context map and then start building stuff, right? And that doesn't work, because bounded context mapping, I think, a personal opinion, is not a tool you can use. It's a culture. Mapping your context is something you do continuously all the time, because they change, your company evolves, needs change, knowledge changes, just the people working that changes, and the understanding or the availability of code and experts, all those things are in constant flux. You can't keep your context map static. So having a context map as a transparency tool to show everyone that's new and to show other people, this is how we operate, this is how we perceive our mental model of how we are structured. As a transparency tool, this is very important for psychological safety. It tells people what to expect from a relationship and from who you can invite into a discussion about what topics, who's knowledgeable. You get all those information from a context map, as well as it determines when your code changes or when your strategy changes, you represent in that context map what's about to happen now. So it's a planning tool and it's a transparency tool. So it needs to be ingrained in the company culture, and it can't be just quickly rushed, implemented, and then you're done and have a happy new tool in your belt. So what are the forces that pull on your context map? Well, you can see from the picture already, there are technical forces and there are organizational forces. And the list down here is not finite. This list goes on and on, but there are so many different forces pulling on your context map. There is the vision of the business. Where do we want to go? Amazon has been selling stuff online. Great job. Then they started automating warehouses and getting rid of coworkers and employees and putting robots in and optimizing for that, have swimming warehouses and flying warehouses and whatnot. Then they optimize delivery, and today selling stuff online is a hobby, and they actually do cloud computing services and functions and stuff like that. So the vision of where your company will steer next can change, and that will change your context map a lot. The same goes for the product you're developing and team's location or relocation. What if people in a team move to a different place, or if a building gets shut down and people move in a different office? Relationships change, emotions change, and because your whole organization reshapes itself over time through various reasons, your context map will grow with it. And this is one of the hardest things I find, to keep your initial context map in sync with reality. And I want to talk about some tricks of how to get there. And not to forget, in the end, it's not only business people, it's also data cohesion, the domain itself, and even the code that determines your context map. Your best plan goes down the drain when there's legacy code in place that you just can't refactor, or not in a given frame of time. So you have a context that is a solution space that is already implemented, that is very undesirable to have, but you can't really get rid of it. So you need a good map, but mapping is its own journey. So far, we optimized the local, we optimized the inside of a bounded context, and we talked about how we can gather who is responsible, who are the stakeholders, who do we talk to, and we protect ourselves from the outside world inside of a bounded context. But we need to optimize the whole system. We need to optimize the relationships because the relationships between the contexts shape the whole global structure of our bounded context. I want to take a short break and see if there are some questions before we go into the next phase.
Yeah, we do have one actually. Thanks, Marco, for your talk so far. From Christian, its heuristics seem to be the new word in DDD. Can we briefly touch on what exactly we mean by heuristics?
Yes, so I will not give you the clear definition, because then a lot of people will whip my back, but a heuristic is basically a rule of thumb. It's something that steers you in the right direction. It's a tool you can use to gain knowledge or to enforce quick experimentation to get better insights into your problem space. So that was very abstract. To give you a short example list, a metric would be something that you measure by, right? So something, a known rule that you know, if I follow this metric, I get a certain result. A heuristic is, I don't know the result. I don't even know if this tool will work, but from experience or from a lot of thinking, I think when we do this will gain more information about a certain thing. So heuristics is basically rules of thumbs that you can use. If you have many heuristics, you have a good tool belt that you can use to gain quick insights or to build better systems without having to go into proving that this is the best way. Because in a highly uncertain world, and we are in such a complex place here when we do domain-driven design, you don't do DDD when you basically build something that everybody can build. If you are in complex and unexplored space, you need to make decisions fast. And you want to learn from your decisions, so have small controlled experiments, which is a heuristics in of itself. I hope that answers your questions, kind of.
Okay, thanks, Marco. We have another one before we move on from Fabrizio, who says, in my honest opinion, one of the most difficult things is to explain to non-tech folks the importance of identifying bounded context and organize product and tech teams around them. Any experience you can share?
Oh yeah, a lot of painful experience. Yeah, I have the same feeling. So it's my feeling right now that in those companies where it's really hard to explain the concept of why contexts are important, why reducing mental load is important, and why having a focus with a cohesive group on solving a certain thing because it has more business value than the other thing, and let's not mud them together. Companies that do not understand this don't have a DDD problem, they have a psychological safety problem, so a cultural problem first. So it is my experience, just my personal experience. I've seen companies where you try to explain these things and the people are like, yeah, what are you trying to tell me? Let me model with you. Oh yeah, now I understand. Yeah, that makes sense. Great. And even if they don't agree on the methods, you strive towards a common goal of optimizing the system and helping them become better at what they do. But there are companies where people have always done this way, and now you come with your new DDD stuff. So basically, when you start the conversation, they already mistrust you because you're a developer and they are business experts. So what do you want? If that's the case, you have a broken culture that I don't have a good recipe on repairing, not something in a short time frame. But persistence is the thing that I try to do, helping companies by making everything transparent and being persistent with it, even if people hit me in the face. I just try to show them the reality that I see all the time. And at some point, there's a decision to be made. Right? And yeah, that's my experience so far. Any more
Excellent.
questions?
Looks like no for the time being, but please keep them coming because we will have other breaks and Marco will be more than happy to answer them.
Fantastic.
All for you.
Okay, great. So let's talk about the nature of relationships in a bounded context map. We just talked briefly about the importance of psychological safety. And when I think you need psychological safety to actually start mapping, if you have no trust in your company, if the business people do not talk to technical people, or if they look down upon them, or the other way around, if there's any kind of mistrust, hatred, or whatever negative emotions, those need to be resolved before you can actually start building a good map, because otherwise people will withhold information, not be truthful, use information as currency, and all those misbehaviors. So it's a broken system from the start. But if you build a relationship map, if you have your bounded context and you map out the relationship, you can use it as a transparency tool. So now emotional safety comes, psychological safety comes as an outcome. Because when I understand that I am, for example, downstream in this relationship between the upper context and the lower context, then I understand that I can ask for change, but the other context is maybe core domain. So they will determine when they can build in my wishes of change. But if they want change to happen, I have to adhere because I'm here to support them. And this is represented in the nature of the relationship. There are three main categories of relationship. There's upstream and downstream, which means the upstream has more ways of damaging the downstream, so it has to be cautious, of course, but when the upstream does something, it affects the downstream context way more. It's like two cities living on a river, and the pollution of the water in the upstream city pollutes the downstream a lot, the other way around, not so much. Then there's a mutually dependent category. If you have a mutually dependent relationship, that means you either fail together or you succeed together. So that means you have a different way of communication if you really want to excel as a company. And then there is free relationships, which means there's something happening in between, but it doesn't determine the success of either team or of either bounded context. So given the three different natures of relationships, that's already a good map. If you start with that, if you had no mapping before, this is highly valuable. You can get a lot of information from just seeing, oh, these are the different solution spaces we're having. And there are teams, there's a team over here and a team over there. And this team is downstream from that team. That explains why the other team, when they change stuff, they hurt this one team all the time because they don't really care. And if I understand the context map correctly, they shouldn't really care. So if I'm in the downstream team, I understand I have to protect my system from the changes that happen frequently and find good solutions, either in communication, organization, or technical, whatever the specific problem is in that case. But this map gives me transparency on how we work. And it also gives me a tool to say, I don't like this. I think what we do is more important. We shouldn't be downstream suffering from your changes all the time, because if I understand the business people correctly, so let's invite them, have a discussion, and then figure out how the actual map should look like, where we want to go. So this gives us transparency and an actual tool where we can hold on to relationships that are visually represented, which gives us the opportunity to talk about them. And I've said psychological and emotional safety a few times now. I realize this is the hardest thing, especially for developers that are the typical developer, which actually isn't that typical, but talking about your own emotions and how you feel in a situation of low power is really, really, really hard, because the ramifications are high, the stakes are high. So we can specify even more. If we have a context map and we understand we're upstream, downstream, or mutually dependent, we can specify the exact nature of our relationship to be able to have better heuristics and ideas on how to deal with the other side of that relationship. Let's talk about a few examples. So there is a partnership relationship, which is, for example, a mutually dependent one. Partnership means we both succeed together, we both fail together, we have high stakes, and we have high communication together. The upside is, when we want to do something, we can just do it together. You have your model, I have my model, and we talk about the interface and the evolution of our interface. When do we make changes together? When do we change how we work? And then we succeed together because we have a high bandwidth communication, which is also the downside of a partnership. Having a partnership relationship is great because collaboration and cooperation is high, but also you need a high bandwidth communication, and that is time consuming and emotionally draining. So there's an upside and a downside, of course. Like everything in life, it's a trade-off. Then we have a shared kernel. A shared kernel is a bounded context that has a common small subset that many other bounded contexts share. For example, let's make it a very trivial example, customer information. You have a customer in your system and there's a certain information and a little behavior around that. And every context needs the exact same information and the exact same behavior around that. So instead of re-implementing it multiple times or making one of the bounded contexts the dominant force and creating some kind of upstream downstream relationship, we can all come together and build a shared kernel, a small, and the stress lays on small, a very small piece of the system that we all build together and design together. So when something changes in the customer information, we all come together, change the model together, and implement this model in our own context or use it there. Then you have the customer-supplier relationship, which is a classical upstream-downstream relationship. And because the supplier is upstream and they have more leverage, they have a lot of power, but the customer is still a customer. So they can say, we need some change. We need some change that must happen in the next few weeks. And then you can negotiate and budget tasks and requirements. And the suppliers will adhere to that plan under certain conditions. So everyone needs to understand the commitment both parties are making and the supplier is specifically making to the customers and the schedule that results from it. And in a customer-supplier relationship, you actually can negotiate these things. And then you have the conformist, which is the small leech I drew here. So there is already a domain model, it's a blue circle, and you just attach yourself to that domain model. There is no real the domain model doesn't even know the conformist exists in many cases. If you have a reporting engine and you're just reading the databases or the objects of another bounded context, just in the way they are implemented, the upside is you have no interaction necessary. You can just start building stuff, take all the information in and build something on your own. And it simplifies integration. And also you use the same domain language immediately. Super great. The downside is when that bounded context is changing something, you're screwed. Now you have to change your own idea, your own mental model and implementation, and you had no control over that. So conformist pattern is an easy integration, an easy start, and some contexts are very well done like this, but there's a huge danger because you have a dependency that you have no control over. And then there's the anti-corruption layer, which is, let's put it mildly, one of the most misunderstood bounded context patterns. The anti-corruption layer protects one bounded context from the changes or malicious behavior from another bounded context. So let's say you have two teams that work at a very different pace, and if the upstream team is moving very fast and changing the interface all the time because they want to optimize for whatever, we are downstream, we don't care, and now we have to do all those changes all the time. We are forced to work and change our whole mental model or code base, but we don't want to. So we can put an anti-corruption layer in front that does the translation. Of course, someone has to maintain this anti-corruption layer, and there will be a few people from either our or both contexts or someone else making that translation, but we only have to change when there's an actual business behavior changing that makes it necessary for our mental model to be adjusted. But if they change from REST interface to another kind of messaging, and now they're sending us 0MQ messages and whatever, we don't care. The anti-corruption layer will just dampen that and talk to us in the language that we have already understood for all those times, all those years. But the downside of an anti-corruption layer, and this is a very, very hard thing, is it separates two cultures. It disturbs communication between both bounded contexts, because now we have a layer in between that protects us in a good and in a bad way. And now we won't talk to people from the other context anymore. So our cultures, our mental models, and our implementation details will diverge over time, and we have no chance of getting them synchronized. So the initial pattern most people use when they build their first bounded context map is put anti-corruption layers everywhere, because that's the simplest thing you can do to protect yourself from the actual intricacies of communication with other people. Don't. Really don't, because it hurts you. Build an anti-corruption layer only when it's necessary because of the nature of the relationship and not as a default. It should be argued. It shouldn't be the default setting ever. Okay, so the next bounded context pattern, relationship pattern, is the open host. An open host is a bounded context that is basically providing a service and saying, look, I have so many customers, I can't build customer-supplier relationships with everyone. That is not feasible. Let's say your Google Maps, you don't want to talk to every user and define an interface. What you will do is you provide an interface and you guarantee it will be working for a long time. When it changes, you will let people know upfront, and those changes will come slowly. So you can change your internal model as much as you want. As an open host, you provide a stable API to the outside world, so everybody can use it and they don't have to put their own anti-corruption layers in front of it. So you're basically protecting the outside world from you. Kind of feels like an inverse anti-corruption layer. I have to think about that later. And then there's a published language. Published language is the nature of a relationship where the relationship is not between two parties, but between an unknown number of parties. And there is a language that you can implement if you want to take part in that conversation. So if you want to do some transactions on the European banking system, you're not going to talk to all those banks and make an interface, or you don't take the one open host for the European banks that there is, because there is none. You learn the language of the SEPA transactions. When you speak that language, you can interact with anyone. And it's often used with an open host. So open hosts often use published languages, but a published language in of itself is a contract based on a language that you can implement to have easier interactions with unknown other bounded contexts. And of course, there's also the relationship of separate ways, which is kind of funny in the expression, but it means there is a connection. There is a connection between two bounded contexts. But for example, those teams can't work together for political reasons, for example. That means if you want to send a message from one part of the domain into another part of the domain, you will send an email with a link. People can click upon it and that will call that application. But those two developing teams won't integrate with each other. And then you have a separate ways connection. If you have that, it's important to mark it in your context map, of course, because expectations, right? And my favorite one, because that's the one I'm working on most of my time, is a big ball of mud. The big ball of mud is a context pattern when you find you have a legacy that you can't refactor, when you have a huge mess in your system that is something you don't want to optimize, you just want to protect yourself from. Draw a big brown circle around it. It's a big ball of mud. Do not try any sophisticated modeling in there because it won't work. This is something you want to get rid of, or in many cases, you can't really get rid of it ever. So you want to protect yourself and find some barriers so you can build meaningful domain software, domain-driven software on the outside of the big ball of mud. try not to integrate too much into it. And it's important to mark it out so you see where you're actually hindered by your old implementation. So these are the patterns from the initial Eric Evans book about domain-driven design. But this list is not finite. I think this list has no definite end. There's so many different uses, expressions you can find, metaphors you can find. These patterns just help you communicating the nature of a relationship. When you find something new happening, like GDPR arrived and it was a kraken unleashed on Europe, every company had to adhere to it. In your company, every bounded context is affected, but not by choice, not because your domain experts said, yeah, let's do this, that's great, but there's a law coming and now it's just smashing in your ocean and you have to deal with it. So this is a kraken context, touching all of your context by force, and you have to deal with it. There is also a multitude of translating bounded contexts patterns written by Nick Tune on his blog. And I think every domain-driven designer is experimenting with their own ways of expressing how a relationship can be. Find your own heuristics, and when they're good, when the patterns are good, publish them, use them, experiment with it. Everything that helps you to get a clearer understanding of the implications of a relationship is something beneficial that we can use in the community. So in your context map that you drew before, you want to represent these specifics. It's not only upstream, downstream. With a little bit of dialogue, we figured out this is a customer-supply relationship. Now we know what to expect. It's not just we are more affected by the upper decision. We understand we're a customer, so we will be affected most of the time, but when we want change to happen, we can ask for it, we can negotiate a deal, and we can agree upon when to do this change and who's responsible and all those things, because we are a customer and have power here. And I just realized that I wrote them in the wrong order. Cool find, thank you. So again, there's a high importance on the psychological safety side. You need to have the ability to talk between both parties. Otherwise, you will not get the real map. But not getting the real map, but having a feeling of, yeah, we built something, but it's not the real thing. It's already valuable information. So whatever you can gather on information, make it transparent. And whenever you have friction in modeling, you model something, you use it in the real world, and it doesn't fit because in the real world, people behave differently than you actually modeled. Cool, that's good feedback. Now you know your model is wrong, adjust your model together in the next session. Take those informations in. And also this kind of map, not only the relationships give you valuable information, also the nature of the context. It's a generic, a core, a supporting. A few days ago on Twitter, someone asked, yeah, but what's the human side of this? Having a generic bounded context, who wants to work in a generic context when the core is where it's at, right? I mean, you're not delivering value for the company when you're in the generic part of things. I think that's very wrong. The core part is the reason why the business actually exists, but that doesn't mean that I can't find pride in my work of building the best supporting context I can, or the best payment system built in-house, because we want to deliver quality in a level that we don't trust PayPal to. It's a generic context, of course, and I'm not doing the recommendation engine because I'm not into AI and stuff, but I can build great technology and great service, and I can make another system happy, the core domain. So I think this is a very good thing. If your emotions say, I only want to work in core, such a context map gives you a good overview of where you want to be in the company, and it can explain to you why you're unhappy at the moment. Now you understand why you are not calling the shots because you're in the other team. But if you say, I want to be in the generic team, I want to make the system go really great, awesome. All these things give you information and control. So yeah, end of sentence. Before we come into the next topic of complexity and evolution, I want to take another short break and see if there has some questions that came up.
Thanks, Marco. No, we don't have new ones as such, but one observation by Fabrizio was related to the previous section. Maybe DDD in general is missing more marketing stuff, like courses, workshops for PO, CTO, C-levels in general. But that was more a consideration, I guess, more than a question.
Yes.
And so, other than that, whenever you want.
Yeah, let me just do that now.
Yeah, please.
I totally agree. There's a lot of things missing, but then again, DDD is more than just the book or a few conferences. the whole complexity thing, Kinevin, has nothing to do with DDD per se, but there is people working on complexity and on system thinking and on psychological safety and all those things, agile, the whole agile word, all that integrates with domain-driven design. And these worlds aren't really indistinguishable from each other. So when you want to introduce context mapping, my proposal would be, even if there is no marketing material out there, it's not about calling it bounded context mapping and domain-driven design when you want to sell it to your business people. So yes, we can do more as a community. And at DDD Europe, for example, is having a Foundations Day and also a day where people who are non-programmers are invited, and conferences are doing more of those things, and more consultants are actually trying to help the non-developers to understand that side. But it's on your own. You can say, hey, look, we have relationships in our company that don't really add up. There are people with expectations and it doesn't work. Let me draw a few circles on the wall, and you start using the method without telling your boss, we have to do a DDD mapping because nobody cares. As with every tool, it's not about the tool, it's about what you're building with it. You want to build better business solutions. You want to have better internal workings and a better optimized system in your own company. And you can use those tools as something that gets you there. But if you realize people are really kind of afraid of new topics, or they don't really like DDD, especially because it's developer driven, then don't call it that way. Just use the method and use it anyway. Just draw stuff, because in the end, whatever tool you can use, it can help you build a better business out of it. Yeah. Okay. So
we have another one if we can.
Sure.
Okay. So that's from Christian, and he says, let's imagine the example company we see in the current map, which I guess was the, yeah. Okay, now they create a mobile app department in another time zone to build a mobile app. How would you add that to the map?
Ooh, nice. That's a good one. So they build a mobile app department in another time zone to build a mobile app. That is not necessarily a new bounded context, because if the mobile app basically is doing the same thing than the app is already doing, then from a business point of view, it's the same behavior. You have the same core behavior. You have the same supporting stuff. You have a new UI. That's a technological thing. And the piece of software you're building is not the bounded context, but the system, the part of the system that you're actually integrating, the problem that you're solving determines the bounded context. So the mobile app can be a new bounded context, like the up there, like the user journey. You can say, as a mobile user, all these things happen and I have this kind of behavior, and I'm interacting with the core domain by saying, hey, give me a recommendation, and I get a list of recommended products, and then I show them on screen. So then it could be its own bounded context. But in many cases, UI is not really a bounded context, or the application front-end side is not really a bounded context, but it's just user interfaces that ask questions to bounded context and send commands to those contexts. Does it answer your question?
Okay, I guess so. We'll see it soon. Also, cool. Christian asks, name it team cooperation patterns. And then we have another one. Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay. All right, let's go to the other one while Christian types up the question. Are teams always inside specific bounded context, or can they be shared across, maybe for a specific project involving multiple ones?
Yes. Great question. So the rule is that a bounded context can only have one team working inside of it, but the opposite is not true. One team cannot only work in one bounded context. So depending on how your team is structured, or even if you have a stable team that has no fluctuating members, let's give me an example. The company I'm working in has 4 developers. We are one team, but we have 30, 50, I don't know, like a gazillion bounded contexts. It's a huge mess. The thing is, when we work on a certain thing, we set our mind to this mental model that we work on now, and we know what business experts to invite to discuss this specific bounded context. And then the next day we switch to another bounded context. That's totally fine. There can only be one team per bounded context for a very specific reason. If you have 2 separated teams working on the exact same mental model, then it's one team. because if the one team does not communicate with the other team, but it's the exact same mental model they are building on, that can't work. That's just physically impossible. So you are either one team or you work in different bounded contexts. But yes, so you can split, team members can switch to other teams, of course. You can have fluctuating people, you can have true cross-functionality, have your designer go all over the place, but understanding in which bounded context the person is working the moment they're working on it. Okay, great question. Thank you.
Excellent. So, thanks, everyone. Let's move on. Yeah, and
yeah,
we'll pick them up later.
Yeah, let's talk about complexity and evolution. So every bounded context has a different value to the company because it has a different business differentiation, but it also has a certain model complexity built into it. And on Nick Tune's strategy blog, a read I can highly recommend if you are into DDD and modeling, there's a nice tool, a visual tool, a matrix, showing quadrants for business differentiation and model complexity from left to right and from top to bottom. And if you have a topic that doesn't really differentiate you from the rest of the world, when your business doesn't really differentiate itself by it, then you are in a very generic space. No matter how complex the model is, if it is very simple or a very complex model, but if it doesn't differentiate your business from the rest, then it's a generic bounded context. If it is a little more complicated, if it is a little bit more differentiation, then you have a supporting bounded context, meaning in a model complexity, no matter how high the complexity is, but if it differentiates you more, this is something that is a supporting context because it's specific to your business. You can't really buy it off the shelf. You can't ask other people to implement it for you. It's a differentiating factor. You need to have control over your own model. And if it's very differentiating, and then the model complexity rises, it becomes a core domain. Because if the model is complex enough and you differentiate yourself a lot, this is where you as a company can shine. This is where you want to differentiate yourself from the competition. So there are multiple patterns here. And I'm not going to all the examples, but give you a few examples to get an overview. If you find your context to be up here, it's highly business differentiating. You find something that is like AI supported recommendations that always give you what you really want in your web shop. Great. But the model to build is highly complex. You need to understand so many different things before you can actually build this. This is a competitive advantage so high that this will be your key core domain. So if you get this right, you will dominate the market because the next person seeing you doing that and thinking, oh, I can do the same. Yeah, the model is really complex. We worked a long time on this and we experimented a lot to get it right. So now we're the first and it's already hard enough for you to follow along. This is a key competitive advantage. Those models should be your key core domain that you work on with your most resources. If you find something is a high differentiator from the market because you have an idea, nobody else had it, it's great, people want it, awesome, but the model isn't that complex or complicated. The model is rather simple. Then it's a short-term core domain. You can invest in it. You can say, let's focus our business on this. This is how we want to differentiate ourselves. But you know, when you do this, other companies can follow along pretty easily because the model was so simple. It took you 3 weeks to build. The next company won't take another 5 months. They can also do it in 3 weeks. So it's a short-term core. There might be a lot of value in being first still, or just having it. And this is nothing you should build your business upon, but this can be a valuable stepstone on the way. If you find something that is in the supporting differentiation phase, it's not that differentiating from the market, but it has a highly complex model. And I would ask the question like, what's going on here? Are we building the wrong thing? Are we building it wrong? This is where I find a lot of our legacy, a highly complicated model because we didn't understand the business, but still a lot of differentiation happening. It's not our core domain, but this is something only we can do really well, but we build it in such a shitty way and the model is way too complex. So yeah, if this is a warning sign, if you find something in a supporting domain that has such a high complexity, maybe it's a hidden core, maybe something you're not seeing, or maybe you can build it in a simpler way because it's not differentiating you so much. So don't weigh yourself down by building a too complex model. And then if you are in the generic space and you find a model that is not differentiating you at all from the business, from the market, but it's super complex from your perspective, then what the frick are you doing? Are you mad? Why are you building something highly complex that has no differentiation value? This happens a lot with developers that are let loose and have no sight of the business. So if you have no bounded context map up front, if you don't have a culture of exploring the business value of your work together, if people are just coding stuff and they want to code something that is really, they want to try all the new tools and build something with sagas and implement Kafka, Kubernetes, let's put all this stuff together, highly complex, awesome. But there is no business differentiation value, yeah, then you're in for a painful treat. So this is not only a warning sign, this is already the house on fire. If from your perspective, the model is super complex, buy it off the shelf and don't do what you're doing. Rebuild the thing in a simpler way, or just get a product off the shelf and try to get rid of the legacy you've built. So how many core domains can there be? We already had that question. And from personal experience, I must say, beware of a flood of core domains when you're using this matrix here. Because specifically our product owner or product owners, they will tell you that a lot of the things and the ideas they have are market differentiators, and a lot of the things need to be implemented to, it's not differentiating that much, but more than 50%, of course, we're in this area. So yeah, it's differentiating us. Great. And then we as developers think about the model and think, oh, this is fairly complex. So we find a lot of core domains all of a sudden. And the dialogue is kind of weird because after you've reached 20 core domains, it's kind of awkward to say this can't be true. And then you have to negotiate all the cores, all the dots out of that green zone. But what I figured is we did the mistake of talking about the as is and the to be and the has been all at the same time. So to give you a quick example, this is how a snippet, a small part of our domain looks. And I think you can see 15 core domains or so in here. And we analyzed this from a perspective, the business people were talking about where they want to go, what they want to change next, because this is where they strive towards. And we as developers, we were talking about the things that have been in the past because we understood them when we coded them. And then there were some certain powers in the company that were talking about the as is at the moment, because the supporters, for example, this is where they suffer right now. They realize, oh yeah, this is hard for us. And everybody has a different perspective. And the dialogue is way more important than the actual setting of the dot, but it's a great communication tool. But in the end, if you have 20 or 50 different core domains, you've done something wrong. So context maps move constantly from the has been to the as is to the to be, where they go next. And I want to map this. I also want to have this visually in my context map integrated. And this is where Wardley mapping comes in. Again, up there, the link to Simon Wardley's blog about Wardley maps. This is just a rough introduction, but it's a very valuable tool for me to see a line of evolution from Genesis to custom build to product to commodity or utility, and a second dimension of the value chain and its visibility to customers. On the bottom, it's invisible, and on the top, it's visible to our customers. So if I see my customers and their actual needs, or the users and the actual needs, I can see, oh yeah, this is something we're going to solve with something we invent ourselves. This is a genesis of a new idea. And then there are some custom built things that we create ourselves. And there's also products we can buy off the shelf to support the need of the customer. We don't have to implement everything ourselves. And the visibility of the features we're delivering, of course, is high. The user and the customers, they see the features we're delivering. But we are depending on a lot of components in our system. Certain contents in our bounded context that users or customers might not even be aware of that they exist. Anything that is only in the back end of the domain, because it's legally, it has to be there. There are laws we need to adhere to, but the customer side really doesn't care. But those things are still need to be implemented. So there are relationships between the user-facing features we're implementing and the component in the back end. And you can see if you go down to the right, the product, for example, we're buying a MS SQL database off the shelf. We're not inventing that ourselves. It's something in the value chain. It has not the highest value, and it's not visible to the customer, but it has to be there, of course. And electricity is a commodity. We don't care about electricity. It's a given. We don't have to care about that. But yeah, so mapping out the way your domain actually looks in a way of where's the value chain from the user perspective, from their needs, and in which phase of evolution are your certain parts of the system, are your business capabilities, and therefore bounded contexts and mental models. That's very important, specifically over time, if something changes, because the map is always in flux. Stuff that has been a product that you could buy off the shelf can become a commodity. Email has been a product in the beginning, but now having an email address is a given. It's just a part of nature that we don't care anymore. We know that you can send an email to any customer, virtually any customer. So sometimes stuff like this happens. You have a product that is in Genesis. You are building or creating an AI that is making better recommendations and training this AI and doing all the science behind it, the experimentation. That is highly valuable work, and it's up there on the front rows. But all of a sudden, a black swan happens, and Microsoft and Amazon, they just release cognitive services, and now you can just use it and it works, and awesome. This is a constructed scenario, of course, but things like these happen. So you have to visualize them in your map and say, oh, something that has been in Genesis is now a product I can buy off the shelf. Mapping all the strategical developments, everything you plan to do or everything that you perceive, oh, this happened, putting all these things in a timeline, in a Wordle map, makes the evolution of your whole system more transparent. And there's a little danger in the moving from custom built to product to commodity. There's a not invented here pattern. We're trying to move everything to the right through innovation. So we don't want to invent new stuff all the time in every corner of our system. We want to be inventive in some core domain, but everything that we once mastered should become custom built at best. And when we build it often and well enough, we want it to be a product at some point. And as a society, all the products we have become commodities over time because there's so much innovation happening that we make the whole world a better place step by step by step. So maybe that red hill should have been one step to the left, but the not invented here behavior is a big problem in our company and many others I've seen. People saying, yeah, we built this in-house. There are better options out there, but we have built our own documentation management system. Not because there is no better solution, but we don't trust the quality and we want to build it very, very individually. It makes no sense from a strategical point of view, and mapping things in a Wordle map gives you overview. If everything is custom built and you see, oh yeah, those aren't all core domains and this is not necessary to have custom built for the rest of our life. Let's move some stuff to off-the-shelf products because we're better off not spending all our time maintaining custom built systems when all we want to do is innovate on the Genesis products that are our core domain. And then again, maps like these aren't singular snapshots. You have multiple users. You have the actual users of your system that want to interact with it, some roles at the customer side, and you have business needs as well. There are rules inside of the business that users don't care about, but the business side itself cares about. And then the producers, us as developers, we also have needs. We want to change things because we can't maintain it this way. There are better solutions now. So there are multiple reasons for things to change. And you can add colorful stickies or names or faces to the movement and why the movement is happening in your map. Any questions before I come to the conclusion?
Excellent, thanks, Marco. So yes, we have a clarification from Christian from before. I guess the question goes back to when we were talking about the mobile app. And yes. What he says is the context map is not only about relationship between domains, but also between teams. So here yes. It becomes important to also include the mobile app team in the context map. So he was clarifying his thoughts.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I agree. And I would like to discuss this more, but face-to-face would be great. Having a video conversation maybe after this, I'm open to that. Okay, cool.
Excellent.
So any more questions?
Have another one from Fabrizio. Have you ever seen more than one team working in the same bounded context? Small teams focused on concrete business processes like features and flows, but in the same bounded context.
No, I haven't. If I would have seen that, that would just mean that we have different understanding of what a bounded context would be. If you have a separated flow, a business process inside of your bounded context that is completely separated from the rest of the mental model, so you can actually work on it in isolation, that's a great candidate for being a separate bounded context. If you have completely separated mental models inside of a bounded context, you can actually separate. And if you have two different teams working on these two different parts of the same model, which are separated, then in my definition, you would have had two different bounded contexts from the get-go. But yeah, no, I have never seen two different teams working on the same mental model, which for me is a definition of what is in a bounded context. But again, that is just a definition question. If you define the word differently, of course. Cool. So, conclusion. When we do bounded context mapping, for me, one of the key components is the psychological safety and the cultural aspect of it. We move away from reward and punishment and blame culture, and we strive for engagement, because every bounded context has autonomy in what they want to do and when they want to do it, because they are the business side and the implementation side at once for this specific part of the system, and they understand their place in the whole system. So it's not only optimizing the local, it's optimizing the whole global system. There's mastery. So if it's about motivation for the people, for the teams, you have your mastery inside of your bounded context. You can excel in the technology or in the business side or the facilitating side. It doesn't matter which role you take and which abilities you have. Every person is needed inside bounded context, depending on the business behavior you want to implement. And there's purpose given, because that's kind of the reason why we do context mapping in the first place, right? Every bounded context is a mental model around a business capability. So if you work in a bounded context and not just in a technical implementation team, you understand your real life purpose. Either you're helping the customer or the company to innovate, or you're supporting the core business to not have to rely on third-party hardware or whatever. You understand your purpose very well. So it's about transparency, psychological safety, and it's a culture that gets you to higher motivated teams working in highly cohesive environments on a certain business capability. And my take would be, when you go for a context map, read and learn from the masters. Go to Nick Tune's blog, read Eric Evans' book, dive deep into Wardley mapping, but experiment for yourself. Get in dialogue with other people who are also experimenting. The whole world of DDD right now is still in an innovative phase. People are sharing their experiments everywhere. DDDheuristics.com would be a great website to go to, share your findings there and get inspiration. And just try to connect with the community and experiment a lot and blog about it, says the person who never blogs. So, final slide. This is how I want my context map to look in the end. I have my bounded context with a name and a description if it's core, supporting, or generic context for the solution space. And I describe the behaviors inside with a small text. I describe the information it holds, the events that happen, queries I can ask, behavior it does, and everything is written in the ubiquitous language. If it's complicated language or complex language, I even might add a glossary. I describe the people who work in that bounded context and the stakeholders who you can ask if you need more information. And I also include a small picture of where are we on this matrix of business differentiation and complexity, to have a transparent anchor and to talk about it when I feel this changed in the future, as well as a Wardley map with our bounded context here showing, oh, where is it related to and where are we planning to go next? Where do we come from? To have a historical information, at least as a little figure, so you have more context when you talk about your context map. So if you only focus on the local optimization of your system, only on your own bounded context, you get a distributed ball of mud, because every little bounded context is great, but the whole system doesn't work. If you optimize only for the whole interactivity, then you get a big ball of mud in every bounded context, because the whole system looks great, but inside it's kind of like a mess. You have to optimize for both at the same time. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to reduce the necessity of different interactions and the rate of change to a global minimum. So you will never be completely isolated as a bounded context. And if so, then you are a completely separate domain. That's also great. But we have, I don't know, 30 to 50 bounded contexts in our domain, and they all have interactions with at least a handful of other bounded contexts. This is the optimal system we could find so far to have the least amount of change in the whole system. And trying to find those boundaries is really hard, and you won't get it right in the first take, and probably will never get it really right because there is no the right model. You can find multiple models that work well, and only the future will tell you if it worked good for you. And you never know if you found the actual global optimum, but you can pretty easily see when a model is not working, when the relationships don't add up, when your behavior that you have in the real world doesn't match your bounded context map. That's a reason to have a discussion. So either you're not really adhering to your own model and you can change your behavior, or the behavior is teaching you the model is wrong. Let's adjust the model and see the ripple effects going through the whole thing. But now you have a transparent tool to use and don't have to rely on gut feeling and manager elbow grease and all those things. You have something visual that you can attack, point fingers at, and shoulder to shoulder talk about the model. So in the end, you optimize for high cohesion inside of contexts, low global coupling, and this will help you to build actual true microservices, because now you have good boundaries that you can build implementation on, and you have cross-functional teams inside of your context. And that's it for today. Go forth and live meaningful lives. I thank you a lot. And if you like this and want to see more of it, there will be a domain models and practice course at some point in person. Again, we'll let you know on this channel. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Marco. Let's imagine we are all clapping to you, like in real life. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I guess this is it. You know where to find Marco on Twitter at Heimeshoff. Also, we are asking you to fill in a quick feedback form on the Google chat. If you could open that link and fill it in, it's just a couple of questions to understand if you liked the talk and give us some feedback. Lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss the next episodes. But most importantly, thanks a lot, Marco. It's been a pleasure. And indeed, there will be a workshop with Marco in the future. So stay tuned, and we'll see you soon.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I can keep dancing.